Good afternoon, everybody. I run a company called Allego. We are in a software space called sales enablement. So there'll be some applicability to all the topic you've heard all afternoon. Our system is used around the globe, 62 countries, and as checked last week, about 250,000 users hitting our system every day. I'm going to cover mainly about how do we think about technology in the context of selling, in the context of enabling a seller, and more specifically about virtual selling. I actually agree with the gentleman, even though I run a software company, I agree with the gentleman. Software, earlier, that says software is 20%, or technology is 20%, everything else is much more important, and I agree with that. So I think instead of talking about technology, I want to just share with you some of the key framework. One of the saying in technology is that it takes a human to really screw something up, but it takes a computer to really, really screw it up, And so there's nothing worse than automating the wrong thing, right? Using technology and do it 100 times the wrong thing. That's the worst. So I want to share with you a couple concepts around how to best think about sales enablement going forward and virtual selling. So I'm not going to belabor some of the initial trends that we're about seeing. There are two key trends that's driving the industry. Number one is buyers are getting more powerful. Sellers used to control a lot of information, okay? But in the last 10, 20 years, the buyers can get all the information they want before they even talk to the seller. And yet at the same time, the seller is not adding value in the process. And part of the key reason for that is a lot of the salespeople, in their mind, they're thinking, I'm walking a buyer through a sales cycle. When in reality, there's a mirror image of that sales cycle from the perspective of the buyer, and the buyer is going through their buying cycles. It's almost like the other side of the coin, right? And if your seller is not thinking about the buying cycle, they're thinking the selling cycle, they're actually not in sync to what the buyer is looking for, right? So the buyers that have control are going to value sellers that add value in that conversation. So one of the key sort of paradigm we're seeing sales organization change towards is the concept of thinking about the buying cycle versus the selling cycle. So that's one key trend that's going on. The second key trend, and many other folks have mentioned earlier, is the shift towards digital. Buyers will rather serve a web, look at information, look at reviews of your services, your product that you're carrying, whatnot, to see how good you are before they even talk to you, right? And they would rather get information digitally because they actually don't want to waste time if you're not adding value. So there's a major desire from the buyer's perspective to engage you as a selling organization, to deal with you digitally before they really deal with you in real life. And those are the two key trends. But majority of the sellers don't know how to do this. I mean, during the pandemic, it sort of pushed this forward, but this trend has been around for 20 years. It's getting less and less, the face-to-face interactions is getting to be less and less important. It's still very important, but it's less and less important over time. And it's like you walk into a meeting, you know how to shake hands, you know what jacket to wear, whatnot. The sellers that are doing virtual selling today, they have no idea what to do in a Zoom meeting. And by the way, later on I'll talk about virtual selling. It's not equal to a Zoom meeting. It's not equal to a video conference, and I'll talk about that a bit. Okay, so the two key trends is selling is moving from selling towards service. If your seller is doing a great job, the buyers feel like the seller is servicing them. Okay, so that's sort of the trend number one. Trend number two is that there's no question we're moving from a much higher in-person selling engagement motion towards one that's hybrid over time, even after the pandemic. Okay, a lot of things can be done actually more efficiently virtually and in combination with in-person. And I'll talk a little bit about technology behind that as well. So the question is, how do you get there from here? And I will say the first step you want to think about is a deliberate mental model of how do I enable my seller to do this? Okay, so I'll paint sort of the general picture of sales enablement. If you step back to help your sellers to be more successful, there are 5 key things you got to do. Okay, and these map to some of the key processes a selling organization has to do really well. The first is onboarding and training new people. You're going to have attrition. When that happens, you train these new folks. How do you get them to be able to make their first sales as soon as possible, right? There's that onboarding training process. You got to continue to coach them. Are your manager able to coach them? How do you coach them effectively? And then up on top, you may be rolling out new product lines, new corporate strategy, new messaging. How do you do that? Right? That's the launch and rollout piece. And then how do you supply your sellers with all the information they need, all the collaterals, all the know-how, so that they can do their job? That's the content management. And one of the pieces you see on the lower right is virtual selling. How do they move from just in-person to virtual, or a combination of hybrid in-person and virtual? I don't care what organization you're in, eventually you're gonna have to do all 5 of these, right? And the question is, how do you do that? And by the way, these 5 pieces touch on other organizations, other department in your organization, like sales management, like marketing, and virtual selling is the interaction between the seller and the buyer, okay? So that's the map. If there's a single picture you want to take away today, and think about how do you make your seller to be more successful, this is it. These are the 5 pieces you got to do really well. Okay? Now, there are actually 2 big components to this. If you think about what are the software or technology we need to put in place to help this, there are 2 pieces. There's a piece called learning, and there's a piece called content. I'll dig into it a little bit. So when people think about learning, right? Like, for example, I want to onboard somebody. Most of the people would think about, okay, so that means I got to have a trainer, I got to bring them out to some training classes, I may give them a quiz. It's actually very far from that. Traditional training is all about taking the seller out of the field, right? Go through some sort of training regimen, taking tests and get certified and whatnot. The problem with that paradigm is by the time the seller is using that knowledge, most of the time it's forgotten. If later on you guys have a couple of cocktails, everything I just said now, you're not going to remember. Okay, half of you will probably forget about it after 2 cocktails, right? And there's a study that shows after 2 weeks, most sales training program, after 2 weeks after, 80% of what's learned is forgotten, right? So we call that train but not retain phenomenon. The other one is sellers hate sitting through classes. They hate learning. And we all hate it too, frankly, okay? Because most of the training program are what's called just-in-case learning, meaning I'm going to learn something just in case I need it in the future, right? Most people are not interested in that type of learning. People are most interested in learning when the problem is right in front of them. It's like, got to solve this problem. So I got to go learn about it, right? So modern learning is actually the other way around. Modern learning say, all right, the seller needs to do something. Namely, I got to close this deal. I got to convince my prospect I'm the right partner for them. At that point, what are the most important information I need to have and share? What are the best example I can give why I'm the partner? And what are the objections I can handle in front of them? So it starts at the point of need. The sellers will be so motivated to learn about everything they need to close the deal at that point than any time before that, right? So we call that just-in-time learning, meaning they learn it just before they need it. That's when they're most motivated. And then if you think about just-in-time learning, is anywhere between an hour before a meeting to a day or 2 before the meeting. The next stage is really about being fluent. Sometimes a sales organization has a set of pitches or playbook, and things need to be memorized, right? We have tools that help organization load a set of facts you need to remember in your head, right, for the seller. And it takes about 2 minutes a day. It's like a flashcard you flash up. Ask your question, you answer. Ask your question, you answer. And if you answer it wrong, it kind of shows up a bit more frequently. And over a period of about a month, every seller can memorize a body of facts without even knowing they're learning. They're kind of playing a game, right? Gamifying, I think I heard somebody talk about gamification. This is gamifying the concept of remembering stuff. Or we go to every organization, typically there's only 20 or 30 most common objections that your prospect throw at you. And you'll be shocked how few people in your organization can answer all 20 of them correctly. All right, so that's another example where you can use technology to help you, simulate this back and forth. We have a technology called hot seat as an example. We put the seller in the hot seat. They press a button, and there's a camera recording them answering questions live against a computer. And it throws questions at them randomly. And these questions are nothing but the most commonly asked question from your prospects. After you go through these hot seat exercises, you become really, really good at answering these questions. Right? That's an example of what you would do beforehand, so you get fluent at it. And only then do you go back to your traditional classroom foundational training that you may take, when they first come on board, or once a year, or to brush up on some basic concept and whatnot. So this is how we view the way you ought to think about training in enabling a seller, not classroom, but more just in time. We'll call that learning in the flow of work versus interrupting them in the flow of work to pull them out. So that's a learning piece. We can, if we have time later, we can ask some, answer some questions. Now I'm going to jump to content. The other half of sales enablement is all about content. And on the content, it's very simple. Less of files, documents, text, and more of all these things you see on the left. Earlier, people talk about change management, where it turns out in most of our personal life, we're already on the right side here, right? But somehow we go to work and we're into this arcane, like you move back like 20 years when you go to work versus technology you're using in your personal life, right? So modern content management is more of those that look like the right. I mean, imagine if all your sellers have your own YouTube-like systems so that if they have any question they need to ask, they can go to that system. And you don't see text and things you got to read, but you got video of people showing you how to do something, right? That's basically what a modern content management system looks like. So in terms of content, one of the biggest things that the seller wants is one system where they can find all the content they need. That includes all the marketing material, product sheets, everything, as well as learning references, playbooks, anything they need to know how to sell in terms of skills or product knowledge. And then there's another really important type of content you want to think about, is the content that's coming from the field. Okay, so for example, there's nothing, if you're rolling out a new program, new strategy, there's nothing that boosts confidence more than for one seller to see another seller record how they did it and why they did it and what the outcome is. Okay, seeing other sellers doing something is the most important sort of confidence builder, if you will, in the way they adopt these type of changes. It could be an announcement from the CXO's office when you roll out changes, or when there's major supply interruption, there's news that need to go out, people need to answer the question the same way. You could have subject matter experts or executives record a video themselves, send that out with 2 clicks, right? To a seller actually record a video themselves and send it to their clients so that the interaction is a bit more personable. There's something genetic about people looking at faces, right? And in this virtual world, one of the most important things you can enable your seller is to get their face on camera talking to their buyer, either synchronously, like in a Zoom meeting, or asynchronously, like sending them a recording of their talk track and video. I just took my car to a dealer in Boston called Herb Chambers. And I was shocked that they took my car, and an hour later, I actually got a video from them that says, hey, Mr. Lee, look, we found this in your car, and literally the guy just walked through the whole car with a video. I just found that incredibly useful because afterwards, I got charged $3,000 more because he told me all the stuff that need to be fixed, Now, if I hadn't seen the video, I probably wouldn't believe him. I would just say, you know what, I'll think about it. But once he showed me in video all these stuff that's wrong, so I think the world is changing, The concept of interacting through video, not necessarily live, but sending videos around is an important part of selling going forward. And we call these content that's recorded just in time, in real time. We call these agile content. These are content that come and go quickly, but they add so much value in that engagement that it becomes super valuable as part of the content you want to think about when you manage for your seller. Okay. Now, one of the examples, if you guys are curious about what does a system like this look like, you can actually go on Android or the App Store, Apple App Store, and download an app called Ventilator Training Alliance, VTA. This is an app that we created in conjunction with 12 largest ventilator providers in the world. At the beginning of the pandemic, every hospital was short of ventilators, right? So Medtronic was one of our customers. Say, you guys gotta help us here because there's tons of donation of these ventilators to hospital, but guess what? Nobody knows how to use them because they're used to using only one model per hospital. And all of a sudden they got bombarded with like a dozen models and nobody knows. Some of them like from Russia and it's like different, there's no manuals and whatnot. So in 10 days, we put together this app to help all the ventilator manufacturers to put all of their training material onto a single app so that people could use it. It's used by over 180 countries right now, still, unfortunately, after 2 years. But this is an example. If you load the app, you get a feel of what it looked like. All right? It's a combination of documents, video, how-tos. It's kind of like YouTube plus a directory of all the critical instruction manual you can find out there in a single app. A seller wants that for all your products, basically. You want a combination of video and documents in a single app. So virtual selling, me and my co-founder at Allego, Mark Mainaka, we published a book last year called Mastering Virtual Selling. And the way we think about virtual selling is that we kind of break it into two parts. There's a front stage part of virtual selling, and there's a backstage part of virtual selling. The front stage is what most people talk about. It's all about video conference, and how to set up your background, right? Try to get used to the mute and unmute. How many times have you heard you are on mute or we can't hear you or whatnot, right? There's motions, there's all these habits you got to build to be good at front stage selling. But what's more important is there's a whole set of stuff you got to think about doing in the backstage. Because in virtual selling, it's hard to build rapport. It is harder to build relationship. I think a previous gentleman mentioned that. But I will contend that once you are good at it, because you have so much more time when you do virtual selling, you can actually do more. Okay, you can take on 10 times more meeting doing virtual selling than you can driving around meeting people live, right? I mean, as a CEO, I used to meet 1 or 2 clients a day. I fly to a city. Now I can do 10 across like 10 different cities. So the concept of backstage selling is you're sharing content, you're dripping content that's useful. You're recording video yourself. Instead of wasting time doing the Zoom meeting beforehand, the night before, hey, we're going to have a meeting tomorrow. This is our agenda. This is what we're talking about. And by the way, I'm introducing you to the subject matter expert for my company. You're taking like 10, 15 minutes right off the bat, introducing all this stuff ahead of time, right? The night before or a few hours before. And then afterwards, you do a recap video, and you're telling them, hey, this is what we talked about. This is the next step, and whatnot. We have a feature called Digital Sales Room, right? Think of a digital sales room as a dedicated website for one prospect. So the concept is the seller could click on, you need a CRM system for sure. But once you have the CRM system, you click on that particular account and click on one button and say, create me a digital sales room for this client. You create a single website for the client. And everything you are communicating with that particular prospect will be basically shared in that website itself. And there's features that help you get notification when somebody's accessing it. They can ask you questions. So there's a lot of collaboration you can have as a seller to the buyer in each digital sales room, one per prospect. And the recording call stuff is mind-blowing. Okay, so if you have inside Salesforce, the call recording allows you to basically automatically scrape the calls that they're making. If they're doing Zoom call, for example, or telephone calls, they can be routed and recorded for training purposes, right? And we have technology on the back that can listen to what was said and point out who is just awful on the call and who needs coaching. All the way to compliance organization where there's certain things you can't say, right? Some industry, if you say, I guarantee you're going to get this, you could be in trouble, right? So we help organizations put a system in place so that they can automatically detect and train sellers, especially doing onboarding. This is so useful because sometimes you onboard 50, 100 people, and you don't have time to sit around and listen to their calls. So we use AI to go in and pick them all out for you, basically. So we think about front stage, backstage selling. Front stage is about your presence. Backstage is to create presence in your absence. You're not there, but we're gonna, by dripping and make it easy to stay top of mind for your organization in front of the buyer, you're creating presence throughout the whole time. That's the essence of virtual selling. So what we're really talking about going forward is think about the organization that can be enabled in both the way they work through the different processes as well as the way they deal with virtual selling. Again, I think this is fundamental going forward, and the pandemic really just accelerating it. So there are a couple of links here. You can go. There's tons of information in masteringvirtualselling.com. We got lots of what we call arsenals for virtual selling, and then you can find out more sort of examples and how do you calculate return on investments for these kind of things all on there. So anyway, I'll hand it back to David. If you have a few questions, we can.
We can take a few questions.
Yeah.
Sorry to be a bit dense. The platform for the virtual selling, is that instead of Zoom or Teams, or is it an overlay of Zoom?
It's complementary to Zoom. So the virtual selling platform here, think of that as powering the backstage. The front stage is Zoom, and we are connected to Zoom. Okay.
So
yeah.
I go to zoom.com/Allego or something like that.
So you use Zoom to set up meetings, right? And you use Allego to process the recording from the meeting, as well as sharing documents or video separately, or set up a digital sales room for each account. So there are two systems you're dealing with. From
the customer's perspective, do they have to download your app and Allego?
No, it's a link.
They go to Zoom.
Yeah, they don't even go to. So during front stage, when you guys are having meetings, that's just like before. It's just a Zoom. But afterwards or before, you can say, hey, I've set up a site for you. This is all the information that I will be providing to you, and it's one link that they click on. Afterwards, that link is where they need to go. You don't need to send email back and forth anymore. I mean, sometimes you go through a sales cycle, there's like 100 emails, and you can't find anything. Whereas here, there's one link, one site. They go to, everything's there.
So it's like a dedicated customer portal for the content.
For only one company, right? And the seller can do it. The seller can record video, put it on there. The key here is you can track actually how active is the prospect, how interested are they really in what you're saying.
What's kind of interesting about it is how it actually takes the buying journey and allows you to ride along during the buying journey. So you're actually seeing which, like if it's committee buying, which we know is so important in a lot of big decisions, who are the decision makers who are engaging at different points with different content to answer different questions. What are they hung up on? What do they keep going back and forth? So it's almost like you're riding along on the buying journey. And then you're also enabling your sellers at scale to be able to put the right content in the right places. They're almost like breadcrumbs that are just helping people move through the journey.
Yeah, and the buyers like it because it's easier, right? They don't have to hunt through their email to find out everything you share with them. They go to one link, one place. They just need to bookmark that link, basically.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the recording of the meetings, how you get approval to do that from the client, prospective client?
Yeah.
And then I'd be curious to know what percentage, because you should have this data, what percentage of those meetings actually do get recorded?
Yeah, great question. I would say in general we can record about 65% of the meetings. Within Zoom, if you set Zoom as an example, and there's a lot, all the other platforms I'm going to skip, I'm just use Zoom. For Zoom, if the recording is on, it actually follow all the state and local laws about when you have to do an announcement, when you don't. Okay, so in some places you literally have to, and Zoom does that for you automatically. It says this call is being recorded, and usually you come on for training purposes. People actually, I was shocked too when I first heard about this. It's like, oh my God, who want to talk when you're recording it? And I think the world has gotten more and more used to this, where 65% of the call we're doing recording. But those are super helpful to get a sense of how. Sometimes I'll tell you, you'll be shocked on what your sellers are saying. How unprepared they are. That's usually the first impression that people have when they start to record calls.